Hello! Welcome to Biological Psychology. In this video, we're going to address biological psychology at a relatively macro level. In a separate video, we'll address biological psychology at a more micro level. Let's jump in with what is a very busy slide, and I apologize for that, but I would like to orient you in a way that I think will help you make sense of this busy slide. First, you might notice that in any one of the boxes that we have here, we'll see a small green symbol that tells us about the structure associated with that box, and a small red symbol that talks about the function. As some of you might recall from a biology class, when we talk about a biological structure, we're referring to anatomy. By contrast, when we're talking about biological function, we're referring to physiology. So we can think of this as something akin to the anatomy and physiology of any given box that you see here. Having said that, I want to caution against developing a belief about the nervous system or an understanding of the nervous system that too strongly links a particular function to a particular structure. Many times students fall into the trap of thinking that every one structure performs exactly one function, and there's a one-to-one mapping. That would be easy to think about, but that isn't actually the way the brain or the nervous system works. It turns out that in most cases, a given function is distributed across many different structures, and also a given structure performs many different functions. But with those caveats noted, why don't we proceed? At the highest level, we'll start with what we call the central nervous system, and professors of psychology, and specifically of biological psychology, will often refer to the CNS. So throughout this video, you might hear me say CNS, we're referring to the central nervous system. We'll contrast that with the peripheral nervous system, abbreviated by PNS, and I'll call your attention to the coloring in this diagram. There's this beige coloring associated with many different boxes here, all of which are different portions of the PNS or the peripheral nervous system. Returning to the central nervous system up top first, the two primary components of the central nervous system are the brain and spinal cord, and we'll zoom in the upcoming slides on the brain and on the spinal cord. For right now, I'd like to spend some time just investigating the layout of the peripheral nervous system, because it has many, many components. We'll begin by understanding some of the subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system. Two that I'd like to call your attention to are actually down over here. We're going to skip over these just for a moment. I'd like to divide the peripheral nervous system into its autonomic portion and its somatic portion. We'll come back to the sensory and motor in just a little bit. In fact, in the next slide, we're going to zoom in on these two when we're taking a closer look at the spinal cord. But for right now, we'll consider the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system, two components of the PNS. Let's start over here. The autonomic nervous system, or ANS, can be thought of in part as an automatic nervous system. So we're quite fortunate just that there's a phonological similarity between autonomic and automatic. When we're talking about the automatic response of the system, we're referring to all kinds of involuntary outcomes. For example, it might be that somebody shines a bright light into your pupils. This will force your pupils to contract automatically. You don't make a decision to have your pupils contract, they just do it. When you become nervous, you might start sweating. This is an indication that your autonomic nervous system has kicked in, another involuntary response. You might start shaking. You might start breathing more heavily. These are all involuntary responses. You might also breathe more heavily, your heart rate might accelerate, involuntary. We can contrast that with voluntary responses from the somatic nervous system. So as I'm moving my cursor, I'm using my somatic nervous system. I would invite you to wiggle around in your chair as you're watching this video. Those are voluntary responses. You might wiggle your fingers. You might move your head from left to right and so forth. These are all very voluntary responses, and they're being controlled by your peripheral nervous system, specifically the somatic portion of your peripheral nervous system. We can take this system by itself, the ANS, and divide it also into two other components. Just before we leave our discussion of the peripheral nervous system, we'll conclude by introducing you to the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system and the parasympathetic division. A lot of researchers will refer to the sympathetic division as the fight or flight division. This is an excitatory portion of the autonomic nervous system, and it tends to be involved in accelerated heart rate, accelerated breathing, accelerated sweating. It's preparing you for fight or flight. It has an inhibitory counter component, the parasympathetic division, which is important for saving energy. And to keep the rhymes going, if this division is fight or flight, then this one is rest or digest. Also, this one plays an important role in feeding and breeding, or sexual behavior. So we have these two working largely in opposition to each other within the autonomic nervous system. And that contrasts with the somatic system, and those are two important components of the peripheral nervous system. As I mentioned a moment ago, I've skipped over these two portions of the peripheral nervous system. I'd like to zoom in on them now, the afferent portion, which is sensory related, and the efferent portion, which is motor related. Let's go ahead into our next diagram and see that we're still in the central nervous system, but we're going to be making our way out eventually to the peripheral nervous system, and we'll see how these two portions of the nervous system interact. So let's assume that we've got a fly over here, and the fly is zipping around and it's buzzing and it lands on your skin. Your skin will sense that and send a signal down this nerve fiber into a portion of your spinal cord. Specifically, it'll send an inbound signal on what we call an afferent nerve. Please note that it starts with the letter A, and this is moving toward the central nervous system. Okay, it's moving in this way because here we're in the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is a portion of the central nervous system. Critically, it's landing in the back portion of the spinal cord. We call the back portion of any structure the dorsal portion, and we contrast that with the ventral portion, or the front. Now, if at some later point you begin to swat the fly, you're making a voluntary movement, and now you've got a signal that's going out to somehow control your muscles that are going to make the swat on the fly and get it off of your skin. And this is now moving out along these axons that we say are efferent nerves. Notice that this is spelled with an E, not with an A. And these are the outbound signals. Notice that these outbound signals are originating from the ventral portion of the spinal cord. So we have the inbound afferent signals. Those are going to register in the dorsal portion of the spinal cord. The signal might go up to the brain. The brain might send down a signal and say, swat that fly, and that signal will come out through the front portion of the spinal cord and make its way out to the muscles, where the fly will presumably get swatted. Okay, so having spent some time in the spinal cord, why don't we return now to try to understand more fully the other major component of the central nervous system, which is the brain. And here we have a schematic that brings us to a very important point. We're going to ask you to make note of two terms as we're looking at this slide. One term is the term phylogeny. Phylogeny is the development of a species. So biologists can look at how species differ from each other and how they've differed from each other across vast expanses of time, evolutionarily speaking. That's phylogeny, the development of a species. We'll contrast that with another important term for this diagram, which is the term ontogeny, and that's the development of a particular organism within a species. Okay, so we can take a look at ontogeny and phylogeny as we're beginning to address the brain. Thinking in phylogenetic terms, if we look across species, we would notice that reptiles have spinal cords, and they also have these areas of the brain that we refer to as the hindbrain. These are evolutionarily relatively older portions of the brain, and lots of animals, especially animals that have been around for a very, very long period of time, like the reptiles, would have the hindbrain structures, and we have them too. We've inherited them from our ancient ancestors. As time went on evolutionarily, the mammalian line began to develop more and more recent portions of the brain, the midbrain and the forebrain, as you see here. So these are relatively older portions, and these have come on board relatively more recently in evolutionary time if we think about phylogeny. What's fascinating is that if you are a biological psychologist that's interested in the development of an organism, now we're talking about ontogeny, you might use the phrase encephalon. Encephalon refers to brain, and people who are interested in brain development will talk about the prosencephalon or mesencephalon, and roughly paralleling what happened in evolution, you will see that these are the portions of the brain, this upper portion, forebrain, that develops later and later in life. So as a matter of fact, people who are in their early 20s still will demonstrate some brain development up in the forebrain, whereas their midbrain and hindbrain are largely intact by the time they reach adulthood. Okay, let's see if we can now zoom in on different portions of the brain. We'll start at this relatively higher level, and then in the next sequence of slides, we'll make our way down to portions of the brain that are just hovering above the spinal cord. So let's start way up top toward the forebrain. If you took away nothing else from this video, I hope you will take away these 4 lobes shown in the upper portion of this. This is the cerebral cortex, shown up top here. It's a little bit unfortunate that this diagram also contains a different structure that's not part of the cerebral cortex. It's a relatively lower hanging structure, what we might describe as being relatively inferior in the brain. That's its position. It's lower in the brain. It's the cerebellum. It has a very characteristic shape that looks a lot like broccoli or cauliflower, and we'll see some diagrams of that in just a little bit. But we're going to focus now on these. The frontal lobe, and to help orient you, within the frontal lobe, we can see where the eyes of this person might be. They would be right about here-ish. This is the back of the person's brain. Very interestingly, although the eyes are here taking in light, most of the cortical information that pertains to vision is actually processed back here in the occipital lobe, quite a far distance from where the eyes are. The eyes will send the information that they transduce from the light out in the environment through a relay station called the thalamus near the center of the brain that will eventually send a signal back to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe plays a very, very important role in vision. The temporal lobe, which is on the side of the brain, and we're looking at this person's right side, plays an important role in hearing. The parietal lobe is a little bit more toward the back and also toward the top, and the integration between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, the extent to which these 2 lobes synchronize their activity in time, has been shown recently to play an important role in decision making. So having introduced you to these lobes, and I hope that you'll be able to identify these on yourself and be able to point to your neighbor and refer to the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe, let's zoom in a little bit further and learn something about neural navigation. Neural navigation is important because as you're reading information that comes to you from news stories, or as you might be reading information in this course about biological psychology, frequently you'll see a few adjectives and a few prefixes and suffixes that tend to help describe different regions of a brain area. So let's begin by looking at this 2-dimensional representation of the 3-dimensional brain. Again, we have the person oriented in such a way that their eyes are here, the person is looking out to the right. And here, near the front of the brain, we have some terminology that refers to the front, and that would include the word anterior. Its opposite is posterior. So anterior is toward the front, posterior is toward the back. The occipital lobe would be here. This is the frontal lobe. I'd like to introduce you also to some synonyms for anterior and posterior, and they are respectively rostral and caudal. Now those terms are used less frequently. Maybe you haven't heard of those before, but I do have a memory trick for you. The rostral is toward the nostril. So the person's nose would be on this side. This is the back of their brain. This is the front of their brain. So say it with me. The rostral is toward the nostril. Okay? So that means that we're looking at something anteriorly when we're looking at it rostrally, and then its opposite is caudal, and we'll see some examples of that in slides to come. Another important neural navigation dichotomy is the distinction between superior and inferior. That's easy to remember, up and down. Slightly less common for most people is the usage of the terms dorsal and ventral. Dorsal, again, is associated with superior. And here, to help us remember this, I sometimes have students for fun in the classroom hold their hand straight up and put it on the top of their head as if they were a shark showing their dorsal fin toward the top. If you can put your hand on top of your head as if you're a shark, and that being your dorsal fin, that will help you remember which side is dorsal and the opposite side is ventral. Okay, so now we've introduced you to a couple of important terms for navigating the brain, shown here 2-dimensionally, but we have to remember that the brain is a 3-dimensional structure. In this portion of the diagram, we see that we can cut the brain 3 different ways, and this turquoise plane that you'll see here, I'll call it a slicer, as if we're going to slice the brain, and in fact we have some high-tech ways for slicing the brain photographically, so to speak, and we can see lots of different portions of the brain in different kinds of slices or different kinds of planes. The first one is going to slice the brain basically from the front to the back, or from the anterior to the posterior, from the rostral side to the caudal side. This is called the coronal plane. You'll sometimes hear it referred to as a coronal slice or a coronal axis. And here's one of the tricks I use to remember that. This person is looking over this way. We're seeing the person's right side. If you can imagine we were looking straight on, and this slicer had been sitting on top of their head, it would be positioned kind of like a king or queen's crown. And the word crown looks a little bit and sounds a little bit like the word coronal. So if you can imagine this slicer being a crown, it's going to make a coronal slice here in the coronal plane, separating the front from the back. So that's the coronal plane, one of 3 planes that we can use for slicing the brain. Okay, now we also have the horizontal plane, and that's fairly self-explanatory, but I'd like to introduce you to some synonyms that you're going to see associated with the word horizontal plane, or the phrase horizontal plane. You'll sometimes hear researchers talk about the horizontal plane synonymously with the so-called transverse plane, and also synonymously with the so-called axial plane. So axial plane, transverse plane, horizontal plane, they're all slicing the brain the same way. That is, they're slicing it from the upper portions to the lower portions. And this again would be relatively superior. This is relatively inferior. We can move our slicer, our horizontal slicer, relatively upward or more downward to get comparatively more dorsal or ventral views of the brain. And finally, we have one more dimension for slicing, and that's going to be the sagittal plane. As I've mentioned a few times, the person's eyes are here. We're seeing the right side of their brain. Behind the slicer in this picture would be the person's left side. So if we wanted to slice now left from right, we would have a sagittal slice, and we would do so in this case right between the eyes. We're slicing now the left side from the right side. That would be a very medial slice, slicing it right down the center. You can imagine I can slide this slicer a little bit further to this person's right side or a little bit further to their left side. And so I can get a very medial slice or comparatively more left lateral or right lateral slices. Okay, so having oriented you, why don't we take a look now at some of the terminology that we've learned, and we'll see it in a picture of me. This is my brain when I was in graduate school, and I was serving as a participant in an MRI study. So here's me, and this time I've broken the trend. Here I'm looking to your left, and we have a whole bunch of horizontal slices. And as you remember, we also call these transverse slices or axial slices. There are about 17 lines here. And those 17 slices go from the relatively superior portion of my brain to the relatively inferior portion of my brain, and those are laid out over here. As you can see, here we're looking down from on high on my brain. This is, again, me looking forward. This is the back of my brain, my occipital lobe, and we're getting to lower and lower slices, increasingly more ventral slices, increasingly more inferior slices. And here's a relatively inferior slice with me looking up this way. Before we look at some more stylized pictures, we want to introduce you to just a little bit more terminology. Biological psychologists use the word fissure or sulcus to mean basically a deep groove in the brain. So let's take a look at some really prominent grooves that help biological psychologists orient when they're trying to describe different brain structures to each other. There's a very, very long groove that runs from the front of the brain, that's the relatively rostral portions, that's up here, toward the back of the brain, that's the occipital lobe, and right down the center we have this longitudinal fissure. It's a very deep groove that separates basically the left from right sides of the brain. In this view, we've returned to now seeing the person from the right side. This is the person's eyes over here, and this is the occipital lobe back this way. And we can see another important structure that's going to be separating the rostral from the caudal portions of the brain. The central sulcus, you see here, the lateral fissure, is going to be separating in the relatively frontal areas, the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. A little bit more caudal is going to be separating the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe, and so forth. There's also a sulcus not so strongly pronounced here that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, and that's the parieto-occipital sulcus. So you get some idea about how these major grooves, fissures and sulci, are separating lobes one from the other. In the next slide, we're going to zoom in and see greater detail, some of which we will not need to explore, but I will call your attention to, for example, the central sulcus. We'll see if we can find that, and we'll see if we can find the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe, and we'll add a few prefixes to those terms. Okay, so here's another view of the brain. Once again, we're looking at this person from the right side. So this is their right hemisphere. The eyes are over here. Okay, a moment ago I was calling your attention to this central sulcus, and you'll notice that this blue area is labeled as precentral. This is another important prefix. The word pre, or rather the prefix pre, when affixed to almost any brain structure, refers to a relatively more anterior portion of that structure. The word post refers to a relatively more posterior portion of that structure. So we have the precentral portion over here, and post corresponding to anterior and posterior. Similarly, we can return to our phrases of rostral and caudal, and over here we're still in the frontal lobe, but you might notice that this one is slightly closer to the nostrils, so it is a relatively more rostral position portion of the frontal lobe, and this one is slightly more caudal. Way back here we have the occipital lobe, and of course because we're looking at this person from the side, we're seeing the lateral occipital lobe. That's not too far from the parietal lobe, which has superior and relatively inferior components. And again, over here, we're looking at the temporal lobe. As I've mentioned, this plays an important role in hearing, and even within that, we have comparatively more superior or inferior portions and middle portions as well. One other bit of terminology to draw to your attention, and that is, you might see the word over here, orbital or orbitalis. Any version of that word, orbital or orbito, refers to something related to the eye sockets. So typically the orbital areas are not too far from where the eyes are positioned. Let's take now another view of the brain, and we've sliced the brain now with a coronal slice. You might notice a very fine blue line here that's slicing this brain, so we can now get another look at it. And if we looked at it straight on, we'd have this view. And prominent here is a bundle of fibers that help us connect the left and right sides. Now, just to orient you, this is the right side of our screen that I'm pointing to within this image. I'm pointing to the right side for us, but of course that would be the left side of this person's brain. Similarly, this would be the right side of that person's brain, and it's on our left as we're looking at it. Connecting the two different hemispheres, left to right, is the corpus callosum. Very, very important, and we'll have some conversation later on about what happens when you sever the corpus callosum and the left and right portions of the brain are not allowed to talk to each other. Here's another view of the corpus callosum, and this now comes to us by way of a mid-sagittal slice. So here we can see the bundles that would have been connecting the left and right sides. Of course, the mid-sagittal slice has severed the brain left from right. To help orient you again, this is where the eyes are, this is the back of the brain. Okay, as I mentioned a while ago now, we have this structure here that we saw a little while back called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum very much looks like broccoli or cauliflower. Okay, why don't we zoom in and try to get to these evolutionarily older portions of the brain, including the cerebellum. So now we're down in the hindbrain. We've made our way from way up top from the frontal lobe down through the corpus callosum, and now we're really beginning to descend in the brain, and we've got the cerebellum, which very much looks like cauliflower. An important notion about the cerebellum is it's really central to generating rhythmic patterns in the brain. So we have a lot of rhythmicity in our behaviors, including our breathing is very rhythmic, and the cerebellum helps to play a role in that. Walking is very rhythmic. The cerebellum plays a role in walking and lots of motor behaviors. Near the cerebellum, we have the pons. The pons is part of the brain stem, and it contains many different nuclei that also play a role in such behaviors as respiration and sleep, swallowing, hearing when it speaks to the issue of turning our heads. So if you go to a newborn infant and you snap on the right side of that infant's head, the infant will automatically orient toward the right. That's because of activity in the pons that makes that behavior possible. If you snap on the infant's left-hand side, the infant will orient to the left. That again is reflecting some activity in the pons. Beneath that, we have the medulla, also called the medulla oblongata. This is playing a role in many different autonomic functions, including sneezing and our cardiac activity, our respiratory activity, heart rate, blood pressure. Lots of relatively lower order functions are mediated by the medulla oblongata, and that's going to run us down into the spinal cord. Okay, so that completes our tour of the brain, but we also want to now connect to the endocrine system. So far we've talked about the nervous system, which had a central nervous component, and we also had a peripheral nervous component, but the nervous system also interacts with the endocrine system, and it does so by way of hormones. Let's first begin by defining the endocrine system as the collection of cells, glands, and tissues of an organism that secrete hormones directly into the bloodstream to control the organism's physiology and behavioral activities. We'll contrast the endocrine system with the nervous system a couple of ways. Because the endocrine system is so heavily involved with hormones, it's important to note that hormones, relatively speaking, act very slowly and over much longer distances. By contrast, the central nervous system acts according to so-called action potentials. These are electrochemical events that occur very quickly over very, very short distances, usually between just two neurons that are maybe microns apart from each other. Small fractions of a millimeter, actually something on the order of 1/1,000,000th of a meter. Very, very short distances, and they occur on the order of milliseconds, maybe tens of milliseconds. So the central nervous system is operating very quickly and over very short distances. The endocrine system is operating on this time scale of maybe seconds, more likely minutes, maybe hours, sometimes days, and over very long distances, maybe on the order of many centimeters. To appreciate this, let's learn about an important component of the endocrine system called the HPA axis. This is involved in stress responses. The HPA axis consists of the hypothalamus, that's the H, the pituitary gland, and adrenal cortices that you see here hovering right over the kidneys. Earlier in this video, I mentioned the thalamus as a relay station that receives information from the eyes and then relays that information back to the occipital lobe so the brain can begin to register visual information at the level of the cortex. Underneath the thalamus is the so-called hypothalamus. Hypo means under, so that's right beneath the thalamus, and the thalamus helps to control the pituitary gland or the master gland, which is going to send out signals controlling the adrenal cortex, which, as you might guess, will release adrenaline into the body. Again, this might happen over many, many seconds or perhaps over minutes, as opposed to happening on the order of milliseconds when we have neuron-to-neuron communication inside of the brain. One other point to note, in much literature that you will read throughout your life, and certainly in this course, there will be references to renal activity. That's generally referring to kidney-based activity. So to sum up, here we have the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal cortex. And this plays a very major role in digestion, the immune system response, mood, emotions, a broad variety of sexual behaviors. Okay, thanks for listening.